Good afternoon. Sorry we're a little delayed in starting, but we had 3 votes on the House floor and they're just finishing up, and so we'll get started. So good afternoon, and certainly welcome to this Energy Subcommittee hearing on the shifting geopolitics of oil and gas. So this hearing is especially timely because here in D.C. right now, energy ministers and CEOs from around the world are gathering for the 27th World Gas Conference to examine important opportunities in energy trends happening across the globe. And while it's an international conference for sure, the U.S.'s role as a world leader in energy is sure to be the focus. So before we arrived at this current era of energy abundance, some of you may remember that as little as a decade ago, America's energy landscape was in a lot different state than it is today. In 2005, American domestic oil and gas production was declining, and the country reached a point of peak reliance on foreign sources of energy. And at that time, we were importing 8 times more energy than we were exporting, and we were becoming increasingly dependent on OPEC nations for our energy needs. It was right around that time that this important technological breakthrough pioneered by American companies, namely horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, dramatically altered our energy outlook. These technological breakthroughs led to a surge in domestic oil and gas production, decreasing U.S. reliance on energy imports. Fast forward today, and we'll see that this trend has not slowed down. In fact, the Energy EIA projects that by 2022, the U.S. will become a net energy exporter for the first time in over half a century. Should be noted that America's emergence as a major energy supplier to the world is thanks in part to Congress's lifting the 40-year-old crude oil export ban in 2015. And I would note that was bipartisan. President Obama signed it into law. Removing the ban has enabled our companies to take advantage of global energy markets and has resulted in more American jobs, for sure, a stronger economy, for sure, lower emissions, indeed, and it's helping to reduce our trade deficit. The national security and energy security benefits provided by the shale energy revolution cannot be overstated. Every day, we are less dependent on foreign nations and cartels such as OPEC to meet our domestic energy needs. Instead, we are now employing American workers and American technologies to harness our own standard and abundant domestic resources in a way that is growing the economy, protecting the environment, and improving our energy security. So today we're holding this hearing to take a closer look at how the U.S.'s growing role as a global energy leader is benefiting consumers and enhancing the nation's standing on the geopolitical world stage. To provide insight on these topics, we have a great panel of 4 witnesses with extensive experience working in and around the U.S. oil and gas industry. As part of today's panel, we have Dr. Daniel Yergin, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and a world-renowned energy expert who many of us say literally wrote the book. Dr. Yergin is joined by Hamm, the CEO of Continental Resources, which is a highly successful oil exploration and production company that he himself founded, and he had an instrumental role in making sure that we lifted that crude oil ban. We also have Dennis Arriola, the Chief Strategy Officer for Sempra, a Fortune 500 energy services company that serves 40 million consumers around the world. And rounding out the lineup, we've got Dr. Kevin Kennedy, a Deputy Director at the World Resources Institute, a global research organization that spans more than 50 countries and focuses on the nexus of environment, economic opportunity, and human well-being. So I want to thank all of you for joining us, for twiddling your thumbs for 30 minutes while we cast some mighty important votes on the House floor. And I now yield to the acting ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. McNerney, our friend from California, taking Bobby Rush's place this afternoon, who's getting married.
It's getting married Saturday. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding to me. I want to thank the panelists, and I think you're all interesting, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and I hope we get a very diverse set of opinions about the issues here. And it's important to have this conversation with industry leaders, and with policy leaders and with people that understand the business. We have a World Gas Conference nearby, and this is topical, but the topic that's listed here, the shifting geopolitics of oil and gas, is a little too narrow. We should be including other topics like renewables, storage, and other resources that are impacting our energy markets. LNG and crude oil exports have changed in the last decade. When I first got elected in 2007, we were worried about our dependence on foreign oil. That's changed. That's possibly a good thing, but we continue to need a very diverse diverse energy mix. It won't help us, I don't think, to become overly dependent on oil and/or gas. And we need political compromise to get there. If one side or the other dominates, I think we're going to go down a path that's unsustainable. So we need political compromise on this and all the other issues, including tax reform. Renewables, you know, the interesting thing is that the energy market is really shifting to electricity now. We have electric vehicles growing, especially in California, but in other states as well. So we're going to see more and more dependence on electricity as a product. It's not necessarily a resource, but as a product. And so we need to have policies that's going to support that shift. We have energy storage, another thing that's going to be very important in terms of shifting where we get our energy from. Concerning the Paris Agreement, the United States was a leader in this agreement. We're still in terms of cities and states declaring that they're going to continue to abide by the terms of the Paris Climate Accord. I think that's very inspiring to me. And I want to say the witnesses, Dr. Yergin, your scholarship has advanced the field of energy. I really appreciate what you've been able to accomplish in terms of providing the history. And one of the things that strikes me about your scholarship is that we see a cyclical market. The oil market it goes in very big cycles about every 10 or 15 years. And right now we're on a low energy cost part of that cycle, but I think that's probably going to change in another 5 years based on history, nothing more. Mr. Kennedy, World Resource Institute Climate Initiative is the gold standard for providing advice, so thank you for coming today. Mr. Arriola, Sempra holds utilities in my home state and has a diverse generation of energy assets here and abroad. I hope that it stays that way. Mr. Hamm, you have been a leader, and I appreciate what horizontal drilling has done to the energy markets in this country. We need to keep an eye on that to make sure that it doesn't cause problems in our states. We know that there's problems with earthquakes. We know that there's potential problems with groundwater contamination and so on. So it's important to keep an eye on that. At any rate, I'm going to yield if any Democrats want to take a minute or two. With that, I'll yield back to the chair.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the chair of the full committee, Mr. Walden, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. To our panelists, welcome. Thank you for being here today and sharing with us on these issues that are so important. We have an excellent lineup of witnesses, Mr. Chairman, and we're going to learn a lot. This is, of course, a big week in Washington, D.C. It is when America hosts the World Gas Conference. They call it the Olympics of Natural Gas, and indeed it is. It brings together hundreds, actually thousands of participants and energy ministers and CEOs from global energy companies to discuss strategic, commercial, and technical issues facing this really important American industry. It's been 30 years. Ronald Reagan was president the last time America hosted this, and the energy picture was quite different then than it is today. So it's kind of interesting to reflect back on those times. But today, the United States is the world's #1 producer of petroleum and natural gas. Our markets are more open, transparent, and competitive than they've ever been. Prices for consumers are low and stable. There are always ups and downs. But we've cut our imports by about 75% since they peaked in 2005. And if this trend continues, we'll be net energy exporters in just a few short years. We got there by repealing the Jimmy Carter-era supply and price controls to encourage a free market for energy commodities. We've taken steps to improve our regulatory policies. We know we have a lot more to do there. And reform our outdated tax code to encourage domestic production. And piece by piece, we've removed restrictions on energy trade to allow American energy to compete in the global marketplace. Mr. Hamm's done a lot in that effort globally. Most recently, as members on this committee will remember, we repealed the 40-year-old ban on crude oil. Now, just 2 years later, we're exporting more than 1.5 million barrels per day of crude oil to countries around the world. This is big. The shale revolution, now 10 years in the making, has had an enormously positive impact on the economy. It's created hundreds of thousands of jobs, billions of dollars in investment that wouldn't have happened were it not for our energy abundance in the United States. The jobs and investments are widespread. They're across all sectors of the economy and all 50 states. It's also had a big impact on our power sector, and with the shift to abundant and cheap natural gas, we've seen a huge reduction in our carbon emissions, enormous. In fact, the U.S. is leading the world in reducing carbon emissions, and by a large margin. Since peaking in 2005, our carbon emissions have declined steadily, and this trend looks likely to continue. This just goes to show you don't always need a government mandate to get it done. If you believe in the free market system and innovation that comes from it, we can do a lot to clean up the environment and create great American jobs and develop American energy. So we're seeing these benefits today, and as we emerge as a world-leading LNG exporter, our trading partners will share in this good fortune. The outlook for American energy is bright. With plentiful reserves, a highly skilled workforce, pro-growth regulations, our energy production will continue to grow, and with this growth, America will see even greater economic, geopolitical, and environmental benefits, along with additional opportunities to help our American allies abroad who are in need of reliable and affordable supplies of energy, not held hostage for their energy by less than friendly countries. I'd like to thank the witnesses again for participating today. We appreciate you sharing your experiences, your knowledge, and your ideas with us about how we can continue to grow American jobs, develop American energy, and enjoy the economic and environmental benefits that come from that. With that, I've got a minute and a half left. If anybody on our side wants to use that, be happy to yield. If Mr. Barton, former chairman of the committee, the vice chair of the full committee, I would yield such time as he may consume.
I basically just want to welcome the panel. I know 3 of you personally, and the 4th one I'm sure I'd love to know personally if I did. So our committee, in the time I've been on it, starting back when John Dingell was chairman, has led the Congress in energy legislation. And we've gone from where in the 70s and early 80s we were trying to restrict the use of things like natural gas and put price controls and various things on our natural resources because we thought that we were in an era of scarcity to the point where we're now in an, I won't say an era of surplus, but in an era where we are on the verge of being the dominant energy producer in the world. And, you know, I think that's a good thing, and you gentlemen have helped lead that effort. Of course, and Mr. Yergin, he's probably the premier, I won't say statistician or historian, but he's certainly one of the leading experts in the world, so we're glad to have you especially, sir. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my 2 seconds.
I yield back.
Time has expired. Chair would recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone from New Jersey, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After nearly 2 years of Republican control of all branches of government, my Republican colleagues have little to show for their efforts, and the little they have accomplished is benefiting the wealthy to the detriment of the middle class and the vulnerable. Just think about it. Skyrocketing health care premiums and growing numbers of the uninsured, a widely unpopular Trump tax scam, trillions of dollars in new and mounting debt, and now a devastating Trump-inflicted policy that stripped thousands of children from their parents. So faced with the failure of their policies, Republicans have started to retreat to their safe spaces, including proposing draconian cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security as part of their new budget, and now, of course, today's old favorite, cheerleading for fossil fuels. The latest version of this tired old story has Republicans going so far as to trying to legislatively blackmail states like New Jersey that have stood up to the administration's oil above all agenda by imposing sizable fees on any state that refuses to rubber stamp President Trump's offshore drilling expansion policy. Early this year, New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy listened to our coastal communities and blocked offshore oil and gas drilling in state waters. The Jersey Shore, where I live, is a priceless national treasure that is an engine for our tourism industry that generates $38 billion a year and one of the largest recreational fishing industries in the nation. That's all threatened by offshore drilling, which will destroy our coastal economy. We simply don't need to risk the health and vitality of our coastal communities for the sake of putting more fossil fuels into our energy mix. We've seen this show before. First, rising gasoline costs or something else moves us towards reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. Then in response, fossil fuel industry executives come to Congress to tell us that the only solution to our problems is to ramp up drilling and decrease restrictions on their industry in order to increase supply. That's happening today, as reckless Republican policies have led to a significant jump in the price of gasoline since March. In fact, the price of gas has gone up nearly 25% since President Trump took office. You'd think that would lead to an effort to support cleaner, less gas-guzzling vehicles, but that logic is lost on President Trump and his ethically challenged EPA Administrator, Scott Pruitt, who have gone completely in the opposite direction. They've moved aggressively against clean cars and a diverse 21st century energy policy. Instead, President Trump has worked tirelessly, put in place a 1950s approach to energy that only an oil company could love and can best be summed up by the words, dig, drill, anytime, anywhere, even if it's in our coastal recreational waters. Now, President Trump also made a foolish decision by announcing his intention to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. That was an agreement we spent years negotiating with the global community and was signed by roughly 200 countries. By abandoning our friends and allies, we have ceded our leadership on climate action and clean technology development and deployment to China and others. We were the global leader, but now we don't even have a seat at the table. And what does that mean? That puts America last and is tragically short-sighted. Republican oil above all policies have always centered on one thing, putting the profits of oil tycoons and fossil industry donors first. And the current rerun of this cliched show should have been canceled long ago, but obviously it isn't. I don't know if anyone else would like my time. If not, I will yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to say the gentleman's time has expired, but I'll be polite. Gentleman yields back. So we are ready for the testimony. I appreciate all of you setting up your testimony in advance. I was able to read it last night. It will be made part of the record in its entirety, and you'll each have 5 minutes to summarize that testimony and expound how you might, and we'll do questions. Dr. Yergin, you're first up. Thank you. You got to hit that button to make sure that you're on.
Mr. Chairman, acting ranking member, members of the subcommittee, it's really an honor to be here and to have the chance to talk about this just dramatic change that's happened in the United States and what it means for our economy, for geopolitics, and the position of the United States in the world. As the chairman pointed out and Mr. Walden pointed out, the World Gas Conference is here. It's 12,000 people from around the world who've come to Washington. I've just come over from it. The theme of this conference is fueling the future. And now it's a very different future because of the shale revolution in the United States, and that has been one of the major themes. This is, as it was noted, the 10th anniversary, at least as we see it at IHS Markit, of what we've called the shale gale, which was really changed the United States and the energy picture. It's had profound consequences, although I think the scale of the consequences would not have been foreseen. What's changed since 2008? Well, back in 2008, we were going to be the largest importer of LNG in the world. Now we're on the road to be one of the largest exporters, and indeed, as noted, the largest producer of natural gas in the world. As many of you know, for 4 decades, energy independence was a cry, but we always were going in the other direction. The question only seemed to be, how high would our imports go? But now in a decade, we have gone from importing on a net basis 60% of our oil to 16%. Huge change. Everyone knows that trade is a very big issue. So it's noteworthy to observe that over this decade, the change in the U.S. oil position, along with changes in prices, has reduced the nation's annual trade deficit by $300 billion. U.S. oil production has more than doubled in a decade, And here's something striking. Next year, or maybe later this year, the United States will become the world's largest oil producer ahead of Saudi Arabia and Russia. It's been a major stimulus to the U.S. economy, not just in the oil and gas sector, but because across the entire economy because of the long supply chains. And I would say in many states that where shale is not permitted, there are jobs that are being created. We calculated 50,000 jobs in the state of New York because of the shale revolution. Industries that were supposed to flee the United States because of high energy costs are now here in the United States spending tens of billions of dollars. Also, this is having major geopolitical impacts that are constructive for the United States. I can see it as I travel around the world, how there's a whole new degree of influence that the United States has because of this revolution. The turnaround in gas is just striking. For the 8-year period, 2000-2007, total U.S. gas production grew by 1%. Over the subsequent 10-year period, it's grown by 40%, and we believe that it will grow by another 60% over the next 20 years. So where would we be without this? Without the shale revolution, the United States would be importing large volumes of oil and gas. Our trade balance would be dramatically different. Millions of jobs would not exist, and the United States would be less competitive. The domestic U.S. power markets and overall economy would look significantly different without the shale revolution. Similarly, the outlook would be different in terms of the global economy and international relations, both for countries that produce oil and gas and for countries that import them. I just came from a meeting of APEC countries, and the role of the U.S. in terms of LNG is something that is now very important to those Asian countries. Certainly, without the shale gale, we would be in a different position internationally. This has brought a new element of influence and independence for the United States. It was so evident this morning. And the U.S. LNG exports are becoming a significant and positive factor in relations with many countries and in a key issue in discussions about trade. So this new outlook for oil and natural gas has created new possibilities for making progress towards national goals of energy efficiency, cost efficiency, environmental protection, global competitiveness, and energy security. It is also contributing jobs and revenues to the economy at the national, state, and local levels. In short, the shale gale has put a powerful new wind at America's back. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arriola.
Chairman Upton, Acting Ranking Member McNerney, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify regarding U.S. natural gas policy and how it affects our business. My name is Dennis Arriola, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for Sempra Energy, and I also have responsibility for our external affairs and our South American operations. Sempra, as you mentioned, is a Fortune 500 services company based in San Diego, California, and we have approximately 20,000 employees that serve more than 40,000 consumers around the world, and we're the largest utility holding company with the largest U.S. customer base. And our utilities include Southern California Gas Company, which is the largest natural gas distribution company in the United States, San Diego Gas and Electric, and Encore Electric Delivery Company in Texas. And our energy infrastructure companies include our investments in Mexico that help import U.S. natural gas and petroleum products to that country, and we also have our Sempra LNG and midstream business. And as Dr. Yergin mentioned, that the timing of this hearing couldn't be better as the World Gas Conference is here in our nation's capital. And with the global triennial event next stopping in the Republic of Korea and China, the conference this week in D.C. is the last time that the U.S. is going to have the opportunity to really help shape the discussion as the host country for years to come. And I can tell you that the world truly is watching what's going on in Washington this week. The outlook for domestic and international natural gas markets has never been better because of two key developments, and one which Dr. Yergin mentioned, the shale energy boom, but also the opportunity to export U.S. liquefied natural gas, or LNG. And if we invest wisely and follow smart pro-market policies, there's little doubt that the U.S. will derive increased economic benefits, job growth, and even greater energy independence. And natural gas now serves as the leading fuel source for the industrial, commercial, and residential sectors of the U.S. economy. And this increased consumption is providing for significant job growth, boosting the economy, and lowering air emissions. And natural gas is also ensuring greater energy security and prosperity globally as well. Now, we own and operate 2 LNG facilities, and we're in the process of permitting a third. Our Cameron LNG is in Louisiana, is under construction. We currently have 10,000 workers on site, and when it's completed and starts operating in 2019, the facility is going to create approximately 130 well-paying jobs in an area that really will benefit from them. We're also pursuing our FERC permit for an LNG export facility located near Port Arthur, Texas. And again, this is going to be employing over 3,100 construction and engineering jobs, and on average over the 4 to 5 year period of build-out, and it's going to create more than 200 permanent, well-paying jobs. Both of these projects together could help reduce our overall trade deficit by roughly $16 billion annually. And these and other export facilities are going to promote new pipelines and maintain natural gas production from many states that are represented here on the subcommittee, including Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Mexico, Texas, and Louisiana. And it's also going to help continue the current cost advantage that benefits U.S. consumers. Now, we have the potential to strengthen alliances and with developed and developing countries by providing a safe and reliable resource to those countries, but we've got to be able to build the infrastructure in this country to do that. And the U.S. gas exports can also help our European and Asian allies reduce their energy dependence on Russia. And if we're to benefit from this opportunity, we've got to take advantage of it, and the time is now. And one of the things that we were looking for from this subcommittee is to, along with the administration, figure out how we can expedite in a smart manner the permitting processes that are required here in this country to have that infrastructure to help export good, clean natural gas from the United States. These delays jeopardize commercial agreements with our international trading partners, and you can be sure that the other major LNG exporting countries are doing everything possible to enhance their competitive position, and bureaucratic delays are not one of the challenges they have. So I think we need to work together as a country to take advantage of this window of opportunity to make sure that when you enter into these contracts, because these are 20 to 30-year contracts, if we as an American business community can't get in on time with these countries, we're going to get shut out, and we're not just shut out for a year. We're shut out for decades. And that means that the jobs that can be helping certain parts of our country, the economic progress, won't come about. And so what we need is to ensure that FERC maintains its typical permit review schedule of no more than 18 to 24 months so that we can get this going. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Kennedy.
Thank you, Chairman Upton, Mr. McNerney, other members of the committee. I'm very pleased to be joining you here today for this hearing. My name is Kevin Kennedy, and I am Deputy Director for the U.S. Climate Initiative at the World Resources Institute. WRI is a global research organization that turns big ideas into action at the intersection of the environment, economic opportunity, and human well-being. As Mr. McNerney noted, as we look at the energy landscape in the United States today, it's important not just to focus on the oil and gas industry, but to consider the broader context of changes that are happening across the country. America has seen significant progress on the development and deployment of clean energy, such as renewables, resulting in large part from the leadership of states, cities, and businesses, often acting with the support and cooperation of the federal government. When President Trump announced last year his intent to withdraw from the International Climate Agreement, some feared that this progress might slow. On the contrary, that announcement catalyzed continued and expanded commitment from states, cities, and businesses across the country. Within days, over 1,200 leaders joined together to say we are still in and committed to support climate action. And as of this weekend, that declaration has been supported by over 2,800 leaders. I've been a core member of the research team behind the America's Pledge initiative, which was launched last July by former Mayor Michael Bloomberg and Governor Jerry Brown, to document the full range of climate and clean energy actions being taken across America. Our report last November showed that leaders representing almost half the population and more than half of the U.S. economy have committed to bringing down their greenhouse gas emissions. These leaders recognize that acting to support clean energy and address climate change can go hand in hand with economic growth and job creation. While many of those signing declarations, like we are still in, are doing so for environmental reasons, Others are acting based primarily on the economic opportunities offered by being leaders in clean energy. They recognize that major countries around the world are investing in renewables and other clean energy sources, and that global markets are shifting fast, and they want to see their communities and the country lead rather than to follow. This committee and Congress can be their partners in moving ahead on renewables, energy efficiency, and other clean energy sources. I want to share just a few of the stories today. In 2017, large corporate buyers in the US, like Google, Kimberly-Clark, and General Motors, announced contracts for nearly 2.9 gigawatts of renewable energy, an 80% increase from the previous year. And this year, they've already announced deals for almost 2.5 gigawatts, almost matching last year's total just 6 months in. The Republican mayor of Georgetown, Texas, said one of the most important benefits of being 100% renewable is the potential for economic development. Many companies are looking to increase their green sources of power for both office and manufacturing facilities. Mayor Ross added that the city's move to 100% renewables was chiefly a business decision based on cost and price stability. Looking to energy efficiency, the private sector has again been a leader. Almost 200 US manufacturers have committed to decreasing their energy intensity by 25% over 10 years as part of the Department of Energy's Better Plants program. These companies have already reported $3.1 billion in reduced energy costs. We also see meaningful moves in the auto industry. Ford plans to nearly double its investment in electric vehicles in the next 5 years, and GM is working towards an all-electric, zero tailpipe emissions future with 20 new electric vehicle models to be available globally in the early 2020s. BNEF projects that by 2040, 55% of new global car sales will be electric. Those states that have put a price on carbon have also seen both environmental and economic benefits. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, known as RGGI, prices carbon dioxide emissions from the electric sector, serving 9 states from Maryland to Maine. RGGI states have outperformed the rest of the country, both environmentally and economically. During its first 5 years, emissions decreased 35% in RGGI states, but only 12% elsewhere. At the same time, RGGI state economies grew faster than the rest of the country. These are just a few of the good news stories about state, local, and private sector movement towards renewables and other forms of clean energy. The degree of momentum behind this transformation and the resulting economic benefits to local communities across the country would be enhanced by federal support for development and deployment of clean energy resources like renewables and energy efficiency. As other countries invest in clean energy, it's time for this Congress and the administration to step up support for states, cities, and businesses that are looking to seize the economic opportunities presented by clean energy transformation. Thank you for your time.
Mr. Hamm, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Upton and Acting Ranking Member McNerney and other members of the committee. My name is Harold Hamm. It's an honor to address you today on the miracle of American oil and gas and its global impact. As chairman of the Domestic Energy Producers Alliance and CEO of the company that co-developed the first oil field ever drilled exclusively with horizontal drilling, and a company that is the largest leaseholder and most active driller and largest producer both in the Bakken Play in North Dakota and the Scoop Stack and Springer Plays of Oklahoma, I've been able to pioneer and participate in the American energy renaissance firsthand. I testified to the House Agriculture Committee on July 8, 2015 about the American energy renaissance, and in particular was asking for lifting of the ban on the exportation of crude oil. And it was granted. We got it signed into law. President Obama signed it into law, and appreciate that. Of course, we have to remember back, it was on the omnibus bill. It's a little bit hard not to sign. And a 2-year extension was given to wind and solar at that time. And of course, 2 years times 10. It was a very costly addition of the cost renewals. I said it then, and I'll say it again, the American energy renaissance is the single most defining aspect on this planet today that will shape the next 50 years ahead of us. In the past 10 years, the United States has undergone unprecedented transformation, as Daniel said, And thanks to the ingenuity of Americans' independent oil and natural gas producer, we're transitioning from a consuming short supply nation to an energy long supplier dominating the world oil market today. Our country has rapidly gone from fears of energy scarcity to understand that U.S. energy independence is well within our reach. I think that will happen late 2020, a little ahead of EIA on that. And during this Trump administration, we've become not only energy dominant, but we'll become energy sufficient and independent in the future. And so we have had to rely on other countries to fuel our energy needs drastically in the past, primarily the Middle East. The instability, shifting alliances wreaked havoc on American foreign policy for decades, and that's been complicated by Russia and their involvement as well in the country's global affairs. But the American energy renaissance is rapidly shaping those complicated dynamics, allowing the U.S. to produce all the energy that it needs. Our energy imports have dropped from over 30% of energy consumed in 2007 to less than 8% currently. And because of these production gains, the U.S. no longer has to put American lives at risk in the Middle East particularly. The ban on exports of crude oil was lifted in 2015. We talked about that. And we're now on pace to become a net energy exporter and provide your allies with a reliable, affordable supply of vital commodities like oil, LNG, and other petroleum products. And we can also impact the world with these clean fuels. Rising U.S. oil production has proven to be vital in meeting global demand as spare production capacity, while eliminating dramatic price hikes that have long been the hallmark of global oil markets. Total petroleum exports are now averaging close to 7 million barrels a day, roughly 2 million of which is crude oil. The commitment of the Trump administration to repealing unnecessary, in many cases archaic and onerous regulations is the right move for America. There's still a couple around the CAFE standards that was approved back when everybody thought we was run out of oil. Certainly is wreaking havoc on the highways today and claiming an additional 10,000 lives per year due to the small size imposed by CAFE standards on vehicles. Also, the archaic SEC rules need to be changed that limit our production and booking just to 5 years. If we're to be energy dominant, we certainly need to recognize that. And we've done it environmentally sound, no governmental assistance or subsidies. It's all come from the independent sector. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. And I remember coming to Washington as a young staffer, still young. I remember the gas lines. I remember having a 1 at the end of my license plate, which allowed me to fill up after an hour and a half at a Shell station around the corner here on Capitol Hill. And Mr. Arriola, I don't know how you did it, but you got one of the sharpest people in your organization in the woman behind you, Marion Brown. She was one that worked hard with our Energy and Commerce staff to actually develop the strategy that I got to tell you was bipartisan, North American Energy Independent Plan, and laid it out. We had testimony from Dr. Yergin back then who predicted that we could do this if you unshackle the industry. And I got to tell you, 9 years ago, the day that President Obama was sworn in, the gas price, average gas price, and that was before Memorial Day and before July 4th, was $3.84 a gallon. And it hurt a lot of people, particularly the most vulnerable. And as I recall, that summer, gas prices got pretty close to $5 and even over. In some areas like California, even maybe $6 a gallon. This last weekend, I was home in Michigan. I watched gas prices at $2.65. So forget inflation. I mean, we are so much better off. and the strategy that we laid out, which again was bipartisan. Mr. Hamm talked about it. President Obama signed it into law to lift the crude oil. And there were still some, even from Texas, who voted against the omnibus, even though that was part of it, despite Mr. Barton's pleading, and he did a great job in lining up the support to get that done. But where would we be today without this? And I guess the other quick question that I have for Mr. Yergin, you said in your testimony that we anticipate that U.S. production could grow by another 60% over the next 20 years. You know, I talk to my farmers who use natural gas to dry their corn. You know, most of my constituents, many of them anyway, have natural gas for heating and cooling, and so those rates have gone down. They're not even a third of what they were 10, 15 years ago. Where are we headed with this continued new production that, in fact, not only can we export and so help our balance of trade, but what is that going to do for the average family across the country?
What it's meant is lower costs for electricity, lower costs for heating, and it's also, because of the impact on its economy, I mentioned in my written testimony, we've added about $120 billion of new investment directly in manufacturing, about maybe the same amount as ancillary. So it's created a lot of jobs. It's really been beneficial across the board.
And it's done a lot for the climate as well. I mean, we know that emissions, CO2 emissions, have dropped by 30%. I think half of that is just by the transformation to coal.
Well, I
Or
mean,
from coal, I should
yeah, if you look at it, our emissions today are back to the level of the early 1990s, although our economy has almost doubled since that time, and gas has been an important part of that.
Mr. Hamm, you indicated in your testimony that the U.S. has the lowest gas and diesel prices in the developed world. What are the biggest drivers of reducing those prices, and what can we do to continue to keep those prices low? You get that?
Excuse me, it's a lot of it has to do with the product that's produced. It's like the Bakken, you know, that oil has no bottoms to speak of, no asphalt. Basically, a lot of middle distillates, which is gasoline, diesel, kerosene. And when that, you know, prior to it coming into existence, back in 2007, you saw diesel prices at $4.50 a gallon, and it's because there wasn't much you could wring out of a barrel of bitumen coming in from Canada. But with the addition of all this oil coming in a Bakken, that price went to $2.25, and it did it very quickly. And so, as a result, we see both diesel and gasoline prices the cheapest that you've seen. And so we have the lowest gasoline prices in the world that we're enjoying. And this is with some state taxes on it. And then some of them, like California, get pretty high.
So in my remaining 15 seconds, if the oil price stays about the same where it is today, is that going to continue to see the exploration and the drilling and the production of domestic resources versus going too low and maybe shutting those off?
You know, we have a great supply. You know, I think we're all aware. I'm a geologist looking forward with natural gas. I think we've got a 100-year supply or more. You know, I think we can produce 10 million barrels a day of crude oil for the next 75 years. You know, it gives us an entirely new reservoir to explore. Basically, what we've done in the past is explored what leaked off of these giant shale fields where the oil was generated. And so all we could do is maybe that 15% that leaked off into upper reservoir traps, we could go after that. Today, we can go into those resource beds like the Woodford and the Bakken and produce the oil left in them. So there's about 85% available. What can we get of that? 20, 25, 30%? Sure.
My time has expired. Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your time is more than expired.
Yeah.
Um, Excellent presentations. I really appreciate all of your words. Dr. Yergin, the financial disclosure of climate effects for oil companies, is that possible to make that happen? How would it affect the economy? How would it affect the companies? And how can we get that information to shareholders if they're not going to be able to produce that information?
Well, I think a lot of that is being produced now. Companies are preparing their financial disclosure reports, their sustainability reports. The question is, does it go in the financial reports? Does it go in others? And I think there's a process going on with the climate-related financial disclosures to get the right framework for meaningful information that's meaningful for investors. So I think we are pointing to something that's in process and being developed.
Thank you. Do you, in my opening statement, I mentioned the cyclical nature of the oil business economically. Do you see that happening now, or do you think because of the shale revolution that it's going to flatten out a little bit?
I think you hit it on the nail. It's a cyclical business. It's always been a cyclical business, and if you look at the oil market today, you see that we've gone from that really big surplus that led to the collapse to a tightening market, and you have some very important geopolitical things that are happening. One is the rapid decline and collapse in Venezuelan oil production, which is something that we can feel the impact of in the next several months. To just give you the numbers, Venezuela was 2.5 million barrels 3 years ago. Today it's 1.4. We think next year it'll be at 800,000 and it could be lower than that. And the other thing that's obviously with the sanctions coming on Iran, it's with a very different pacing by this administration than the Obama administration. Right now there's uncertainty about that. So I think, whenever they say cycles have been abolished, I tend to think no.
Thank you. I believe one of the big drivers to the shale revolution was the way that ownership of the minerals below the surface is handled in this country as compared to other countries. Are other countries going to be able to carry on pick up the shale revolution, or is that going to be continuing to be driven in this country?
Well, it's in Canada, but the kind of early thoughts that it was going to spread rapidly around the world is not borne out, partly for geological reasons, partly for political reasons, and partly for the reason you point to, that the resources under the ground are owned by governments, not by the farmers who work on them. I would say the area now that there's the greatest optimism about is what's called the Vaca Muerta, which means dead cow, which is an area of Argentina, and that's where the focus is. But so far, this is really a North American deal.
How about geopolitical leverage of our oil export and natural gas export versus what's happening as a result of us pulling out of Paris and the sort of repercussions of us pulling back with regard to being a leader on climate change?
Well, I think they're kind of two separate things. Obviously, Dr. Kennedy's described the latter, but I'm very struck when I go to a country like India to see that to them it's very significant that there's this whole new dimension to their relationship with the United States, that we're exporting gas to them, we're actually exporting oil to them, and it gives a whole new strand to that relationship and a kind of dialogue that wasn't there before, and I see that in many countries around the world. And I think that I don't know where we are on trade right now, but certainly LNG exports to China we're seen as one factor to change the trade balance between our two countries.
Thank you. Dr. Kennedy, could you give me some indication of the job creation per kilowatt hour equivalent of renewables versus oil and natural gas?
I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but I would be happy to sort of go back to the office and gather some of that information and provide it to you, yes.
Okay, Mr. Arriola, I'm concerned about Sempra's design of selling off its renewables. Can you give me some clue where Sempra is with regard to that process?
Sure. I think what you're probably referring to, Congressman, is a shareholder proposal that we received in the last couple weeks from an investor group. And what I can tell you is Sempra is totally dedicated and committed to continuing our focus with renewables In fact, if you look at, and you know our company, San Diego Gas and Electric, it's actually one of the leading companies that procures renewable power on behalf of our customers. In fact, last year, over 45% of the power that we procured was renewable. And then we're continuing to focus on what we can do from a battery storage technology standpoint and looking at electric vehicles. So Sempra at its core is focused on sustainability, and part of that is renewable energy as well.
Okay, thank you. I like that answer. I yield back.
Chair now calls upon the gentleman from Texas, the Vice Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Fort Bend County, Texas, and I can't tell you how excited I am to have this hearing. It's really exciting for me. I've got all kinds of questions, but since I only have 5 minutes, I'm going to try to be as quick as possible. Mr. Yergin, and this would be also for Mr. Hamm, what's with current technology and current resource base, what's the upper limit for oil production per day in the United States as compared to Saudi Arabia and Russia?
Well, as a famous wildcatter in Texas said about around 1900, only Dr. Drill knows for sure. But I think now an informed view, and I think we see it from even the Energy Information Administration and others, the U.S. today is a little short of 11 million barrels a day. It could be 14 or 15 million barrels a day. Russia is around 11 million. Saudi is like 10.3. So we are moving into this position very significant. And, you know, you take the Permian in Texas, which Mr. Hamm referred to, 8 years ago is 900,000 barrels a day. It's 2.5. We think in another 5 years, the Permian alone will be 5.4 million barrels a day, which will make it larger than any country in OPEC except for Saudi Arabia.
Mr. Hamm?
Yeah, I don't have any change to that. Daniel's right on. This year, best guess that we're going to grow about 900,000 barrels per day in the U.S. So, there's some infrastructure things out there that, will cap some of that, but growth, but, I don't see that number changing for a while.
Is there any other country in the world that has a higher delta potential production increase than the United States?
Well, I'll say that.
I hope the answer is no.
The answer is no. I don't think anywhere in the world has actually seen the kind of growth that we've seen in the United States in the last 5 or 6 years. It doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. It's breathtaking.
What is China's potential oil and gas production as a percent of its demand? Do they have the ability to produce what they consume in oil and gas, or will they be a net importer of?
No, they're going in just the opposite direction we are. They are now importing 75% of their oil, and I think the IEA has just said next year they're going to be the largest importer of natural gas, which has become a real imperative for them. So they're becoming more dependent, and it's striking to see that part of their portfolio now is from the United States.
This next question is for Mr. Arriola, since you're with Sempra. What's the 10-year outlook for LNG prices on the world market? I would assume they're going to come down as we ramp up our exports.
No, Congressman, I think you're correct. I think what we're finding is that as demand externally continues to increase, there's more production going on here domestically, and it's helping to actually keep prices relatively flat or actually continuing to push them down. And as we see additional advances in technology, I think it's really good for consumers long term. So what we're seeing and why countries on the outside are looking to buy U.S. natural gas is because of the stability of those prices.
My assumption, of course, I'm not in the market like you are, but my assumption is that as we ramp up our export terminal capability and capacity, that those prices are going to come down, but they're going to level out, I hope, about halfway from where they were a couple of years ago and where our domestic price is. So if we can get it $7, $8 an MCF equivalent, I hope it's somewhere in that range. Can U.S. exports be profitable in that price range?
What we're seeing from the market is that the demand is there, and Mr. Hamm knows probably better than anyone that the U.S. Production market is continuing to look for more natural gas and oil, which they wouldn't be doing it if it weren't profitable.
Now, this is my last question, and I'm going to sort of pat myself on the back here. You know, I helped lead the fight, and a lot of members on the committee did, to repeal the ban on crude oil exports 3 or 4 years ago. And this committee also led the effort to make it possible to permit LNG terminals in a more timely fashion. What's the geopolitical significance of those two congressional actions?
I think the geopolitical position is strengthening the United States and strengthening our position in the world. I mean, it really gives us a whole new vocabulary to talk to countries about, and the degree and a whole new category of kind of respect and a deeper relationship. So it's been proved to be, I think, very positive.
And Congressman, what I would say to that is we talk to customers outside of the United States. They're looking for options. They're looking for options away from Russia and other countries, and they want the United States to be one of those options.
If I could say one other thing, it also, there's a lot of contention in the relationship with China right now, but this has taken one issue of contention off the table, because if you go back 8, 10 years, there was thought to be this zero-sum game between China and the United States for energy. That's completely gone, and I think that's something that improves our position.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Pat on the back complete. The chair now calls upon Mr. Peters from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for being here. Say hello to Mr. Arriola from San Diego. And congratulations on SDG&E being at 45%. I say it's the highest, the most renewable. If you know of a utility that's doing better, you should unless you know of that, you should say it's the highest, not one of the highest.
We'll do that in the future, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Not that you're running for office. You referred to clean natural gas in your testimony. I think that implicit in that is a statement that natural gas burns cleaner than coal. And I think most people would concede that. The thing that a lot of folks say, though, is that a lot of the benefit of natural gas is lost because of fugitive methane emissions, that methane being a much more damaging agent for climate even than carbon dioxide in the short run. The flip side of that is if you could contain it, if you could keep methane from escaping, you could have a good impact on the rate of climate change. Let me ask you kind of, how do you think the United States is doing in terms of methane capture? And I'd like you to address that. I'm going to ask the same questions of Mr. Kennedy.
You know, it's a great question, Congressman, because I think with all of the advancements in technology and all of the capital expenditures that we've had within our industries I'd say over the last 10 years, we have been able to identify and remediate substantially a lot of the methane emissions that come from the natural gas supply chain. And so when you compare the United States, and this is based upon numbers that were coming out of the EPA, the United States is probably one of the lowest when you look at the overall supply chain, probably close to 1.5% is the number that I've seen. What I would tell you is that there are additional opportunities for us to be able to capture methane emissions that don't necessarily come from the natural gas supply chain, but rather from the agricultural industry, the water supply industry, landfills. And within our company, we're actually looking at new technologies to try to gather this and really create renewable natural gas by using it for either transportation fuels and or re-injecting it into our pipeline. So I think there's more opportunities there, and we're focused on those.
Just in terms of natural gas collection and distribution, it's my concern that the market may not provide sufficient incentives to look after that. Mr. Kennedy, what would you tell me about methane capture?
Thank you, Congressman. I would agree that both that there are many of the technologies are available and can be used to help contain and capture the methane leakage from the oil and gas industry, but they are often not being used to the degree that they should be. And a recent report just last week some academic studies looking at the degree of methane leakage across the oil and gas industry, suggesting that it is much greater than EPA had been estimating. I have not had a chance to look in any depth at that study, but am greatly concerned that that is an indication that while CO2 emissions are down because of the advantages on the combustion side between natural gas and coal, that the methane leakage may in fact be using up much of that advantage or even all of that advantage. I would also agree that there's opportunities for renewable natural gas from other sources. We have done some recent work on that. So there's opportunities to capture other methane, but the oil and gas industry has the ability, but needs a lot of attention to make sure that they really capture methane as they could.
And I would just say, I'd like to follow up with both of you or all of you about what we could do on that. I was invited to attend a conference held by Harvard Business School on America's unconventional energy opportunity, they called it. It was in March of 2015, where they assessed that the cost of actually controlling this was very small in relation to the revenues and the profits. But it just strikes me that we should come up with some regulatory regime, because this is a classic market failure, I believe, when the cost of capturing that little bit of methane gas may not be sufficient to induce someone to keep it from escaping. And I think frankly, Semper's been pretty open to that, and I look forward to working with you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now calls upon Mr. Shimkus from Illinois for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with my colleague's line of questioning from California, I do want to make a point on the renewable natural gas that in the RFS, in the advanced bucket, there are credits for renewable natural gas. That's actually a growing part of the advanced bucket of the RFS, so we should visit on that as we go down this route. A question I have, I'm going to focus on the refined products and exports for a minute. And I would like to ask Dr. Yergin and Mr. Hamm, what countries outside of North America do we ship refined products to?
Well, I don't have all of them in my head by any means. I know Latin America is a big source, sometimes Europe, but perhaps even Asia. I think in terms of LNG exports, I think so far we've exported LNG to about 26 different countries.
Mr. Hamm?
Yes, you know, the refineries in this country, about 30% of it is owned by foreign governments and entities, and they can ship wherever they want. They basically own those refineries. Much of it was built for their own oil, like Canadians, Venezuelans, Pemex. And so that oil basically is coming through, refined here, and where it goes is any customer that they have around the world. And so about 5 million barrels a day is refined products that go to those customers wherever.
Can anyone talk to me the difference between the, in essence, the refined product on the gasoline side for octane ratings, the difference between the United States and the European market, and is there one? Does anyone know that? We've been working on it. Bill Flores and we're focusing on trying to revise the renewable fuel standard. As many people know, there is a push on looking at octane, and then the basic argument is this: why not get our smartest petroleum engineers and our smartest engine engineers to work together to figure out what's the best product? It addresses maybe a CAFE issue. It might address a low carbon issue. So in our research, we found out that in the United States, our regular is 91 to 92 real octane number. The European gasoline is at a 95 real octane number. So the question would be, do you see any benefits of a kind of a unified octane standard in just markets as far as exporting refined product to the European market if we have the same octane standard as they would have? My guess is that would be beneficial just through simplicity of markets and a commodity product. Is that far-fetched, Dr. Yergin?
This is new to me. I feel I need to go back and ask my colleagues who work on refining that question, who focus on it. I'd be happy to.
Yeah, I think, we're putting a lot of time to it, and I would appreciate any smart people looking at this. We're trying to address this, obviously, as the White House is, and the Secretary of Ag, and the Secretary of Energy, and the EPA Administrator. The industry's been whipsawed back and forth with different proposals. And I think that's what happens when you don't have a legislative fix and a legislative schedule and an agenda. So we have a lot of different stakeholders. And the last thing for part of this is, and I'm direct this to you, Mr. Hamm, because we do talk about cafe standards, and without a change in the fuel mix, as we're predicting, the way to reach cafe standards is to have smaller, lighter vehicles, which might address, one, safety issues for some, and then in rural America, a total rejection of, because we like big trucks, big engines, big power aspects. Do you, if in this issue of high, do you see a benefit in the aspect of CAFE if you have high compression engines that can go further on the same amount of gas as far as meeting CAFE standards?
You can only go so far with that technology, and manufacturers have done what they could with high compression engines and fuel injection and everything that goes along with that. And what came down to was the shadow of a car gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's rejected by the buyers in America. So pretty soon everybody's buying SUVs, everybody's buying pickup trucks, or they're buying these little cars if that's all they can afford and putting their families in it. But what we've seen is that we've reduced with seat belts and airbags and everything else, safety fatalities from 45,000 down to about 30,000, and that was the bottom. And now it's crept up due to the small shadow of these cars back up to 40,000. So it's killing 10,000 Americans per year. And we have lesser number of them because you've got a huge mix of bigger vehicles out there with these little cars. And they're made out of aluminum. They crush up like a beer can, kill everybody inside.
Yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Tonko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Earlier this month, Pope Francis met with some of the world's largest oil and gas companies to urge them to take the threat of climate change more seriously. But the consequences of climate change are not just moral or environmental based. Many of the world's largest investors say it is an economic concern as well. Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England and chair of the G20's Financial Stability Board, has made it clear that businesses should be assessing and disclosing climate-related risks. A 2016 BlackRock Investment Institute report concluded that all investors should incorporate climate change awareness into their investment process, and that advice is being heeded. Investors representing trillions in assets have urged the sector to be more transparent and take responsibility for its emissions. Dr. Kennedy, I listened as there was some discussion about shareholders in this whole arena, and shareholders have helped drive greater disclosures of companies' climate-related risks. How important is it for shareholders to be given this information when making decisions on how to invest their money?
This is a topic that I've not gone into in depth, but what I would say is that our economic system, our investment system, which is often driven by short-term returns, has a great difficulty in dealing with longer-term challenges and longer-term economic risks like climate change. And so the more information that can be made available to investors about the implications of the investments and what those mean in the long term is going to be very important and very helpful.
Thank you. And is there a risk to the United States economy if companies fail to make these disclosures?
The risks of climate change itself are actually very great for the U.S., as we're already seeing significant impacts from the changing climate, from increased severe weather, from increased sea level rise, storm surge. A wide variety of impacts are already starting to show up, and we can only expect those to continue and to increase over time, particularly if we don't find ways of reducing emissions. So the more that can be done from a variety of perspectives, including in terms of how investment decisions are made, is going to be critically important to address those real risks going forward.
Thank you. According to Sempra's 2015 Corporate Responsibility Report, Sempra began responding to the annual Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, survey in 2006, which reports the emissions of major companies and releases an assessment of their potential climate risks. Since 2015, Sempra has scored 100 out of 100 on disclosure. Mr. Arriola, why has Sempra made this a priority, and do you believe that such disclosures are important across the energy sector?
Congressman, it's important to us because it's important to our consumers and the communities where we do business, as well as to our shareholders. And as you've mentioned, there's been a trend, I'd say, over the last decade that really started in Europe, but now has come more forcefully to the United States, where investors, and I'm talking about large institutional investors, really do want to understand what companies are doing to address climate change, but not just climate change, how they're dealing with water, how they're dealing with diversity in companies, really both sustainability and corporate responsibility. And this is something that we take very seriously in our company, and actually on Friday, we'll be releasing our most recent sustainability report, which I think continues to get better and better, and it gets acknowledged by different organizations because we go beyond what we need to, because we think it's important for our investors to understand what we're doing on their behalf.
Thank you. And Mr. Hamm, Continental Resources is one of the largest non-responders to CDP's annual disclosure request. Any reason why you do not participate?
Excuse me. There's not any specific reason. The climate change, I'm a geologist. I believe that we can affect the climate, and I certainly think that investors can pick or choose which company that they would want to invest in and who are the best stewards of the land and water, air. Continental certainly fits in at the top of that rank. With horizontal drilling, there's a lot of drilling that goes on, but it certainly doesn't look like it. You know, the methane emissions that you talk about, our company's been doing green completions as long as I remember. So,
But that being said, why not then respond to CDP's annual request?
you know, I don't believe we've had a specific annual request in that regard that I recall.
Okay, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Chair would recognize Mr. Latta.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for holding today's hearing, and thank you very much for our panelists for being with us today. It's very, very important as we go forward with energy development in this country. Mr. Yergin, if I could start with my questions with you. You know, we on this committee have a great opportunity to speak with political leaders and business leaders across the world. And it's very interesting through the last several years, I've had the discussions I've had with those individuals, they've all asked this one question. How is it the United States has been able to do what you've done and be able to accomplish it so quickly? And then the next question would be do we have any competitors or other countries that are out there that are trying to do the exact same, maybe to duplicate, you know, what we've done in this country, and are they able to do that as we did in this country?
Do you mean in terms of the unconventional revolution or
Correct.
in general? I think aside from what we've seen in Canada, which is kind of like a offshoot of here, no, nobody else. And it's a combination of the resource base, the ecosystem, our legal system, our entrepreneurial system, and the fact that we had all these supply chains to respond to it. So that's why, you know, it is something you look at and you say, things don't happen normally this fast, and this has really happened fast.
Well, I know if someone had asked a little earlier a question to you, and you responded back about what's happening with Iran and in Venezuela. Where do you see the United States? I know that this has come up in some of the other questions, but when you're looking around the world, our place in the world, because it's hard to explain to people that don't remember the mid-1970s and understand what happened in this country. And it's trying to explain to people that you know, in some areas of the country, either A, you didn't buy gas on certain days because your license plate didn't end with a even or odd number, or you know, what just people were told we didn't have any energy in this country. But where do you see this country and what that means for us geopolitically then?
Well, I think it was at that time, the view was that, you know, we were just going to be held hostage, that we had lost control of our lives in a daily basis in terms of gas lines and in terms of our economy. And this has been such a turnaround. Ben Bernanke, when he was at our conference just after he stepped down as head of the Federal Reserve, said this unconventional revolution was one of the most positive, if not the most positive thing to have happened since the 2008 crisis. Clearly, people who don't remember, you know, they see grainy images maybe on television of gas lines and said, what is that all about? So that's why it's such a big turnaround. And I think it took a few years psychologically for people to, you know, for many people to realize that this is for real.
Well, thank you. Mr. Hamm and Mr. Arriola, what growth have your companies seen in job creation and career opportunities as a result of the shale revolution? Did I go first?
Sure. Starting at Sempra Energy, if you would have looked at our company just over 10 years ago, our LNG business really didn't exist. So we've hired, I'd say, hundreds of people to help develop our LNG projects in Mexico and Louisiana, and we're looking forward to hiring even more in Texas. I think that's probably the biggest part. I can't give you an exact number, but it's in the hundreds of well-paying jobs.
Mr. Hamm?
Well, you know, our company is like a lot of independents. You know, we've had good growth over this period of time, and the industry in total added over 1 million jobs. You know, basically every sector from the service sectors up through E&P, production, exploration. And so it's been a tremendous driver of the American economy.
Well, I think what you just brought up is also important, because I think that sometimes when we talk about a company and how many jobs are being created, it's not all the folks out there who are, you know, on the steel end and those who produce the pipe, and you name all the different things that have to be done to get there, and so all of the other jobs that are the offshoots. So it's been a great boom for the economy.
Congressman, if I can also just interject that the jobs I was talking about were directly at Sempra.
Right.
If you look at the projects that we've had, for example, our Cameron LNG facility, there are over 10,000 people on the job today. Once we develop our Port Arthur facility, there'll be over 3,000 jobs going for 4 to 5 years. So it's not necessarily just the jobs directly at our company that are important from an economic perspective, but it's all of the jobs that get created by these projects.
We calculated a couple of years ago that it was well over 2 million jobs because of the supply chain, and the Middle West was a very big beneficiary because of the supply chains, because of the manufacturing capabilities that fed into this.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the ranking member, for holding this important hearing, and I'm glad to know that the World Gas Conference is here in Washington. Dr. Yergin, I remember a few years ago, we had one of our conferences in Houston, and you interviewed our EPA administrator, Jeannie McCarthy, and I think that was the first time she went to an energy conference, and I appreciate the hospitality, and also representing an area that deals with environmental issues every day, but that's our job base, our refineries, our chemical plants in East Houston and Harris County. So Texas is the largest generator of wind power in the country right now, and hopefully we can do other things. But what we've seen, though, is that the mix of the electricity, and we do need electricity plants to produce those for those electric cars. And, you know, our choices are, in Texas, we have 20% nuclear power. That's a base power. You know, wind energy. Coal has actually gotten down lower because the price of natural gas is so cheap. And that's why I think that mix works, and we'll continue to see renewables pick up some, but it's easier to turn on a burner on a natural gas plant than it is to try and keep a coal storage facility. Our American energy renaissance, because I've been in Congress since 1993, and it's been amazing what's happened. Mr. Arriola, in your testimony, you talked about how the U.S. regulatory certainty at FERC could hinder U.S. LNG development in comparison to countries like Russia, Australia, Qatar, or Mozambique. What changes would you like to see in the regulatory process?
Thank you, Congressman. I think we believe that it's important to have a very thorough and exhaustive review process on any permitting, especially from FERC and the DOE. What we'd encourage is just making sure that it's as streamlined as possible, that it's efficient, but that we check the box as quickly as we can, that we don't recreate the wheel on every project. And I'll give you an example. When we went through the process for our facility in Cameron, Louisiana, it took FERC 553 days to get through the entire project. As we're seeking approval here for our Port Arthur LNG facility in Texas, it's essentially the same engineering design that we're trying to duplicate in Texas. Right now, we're estimating that it's probably going to take closer to 1,000 days. Now, granted, there are more projects that FERC is looking at, and we've been working very constructively with their staff and everything, but I think part of it is just making sure that they have not just more resources, but the right resources, and that the agencies like FERC and DOE work together to eliminate the bottlenecks to the extent that they can.
Right now, I've been told, and if you could confirm it, the Trump administration's approval timeline for LNG export permitting trails that of the Obama administration. Is that correct?
That's our understanding.
I think that would shock a lot of us.
Yes.
And I want to make sure that FERC has a staff. It needs to move efficiently through the permitting process. I've also, in fact, this committee passed legislation on cross-border pipelines to sell natural gas from Texas or New Mexico to Mexico. And Mexico has literally can only refine about 60% of their petroleum they need for diesel and gas, and 40% of that comes from typically the refineries along the Gulf Coast. The Eagle Ford Basin doesn't stop at the Rio Grande River either. And there come a time in the future that Houston's petrochemical industry may need the gas from Mexico, and those pipelines could benefit us in our industry in East End. Mr. Mullins and I addressed this with a cross-border pipeline that passed the House last summer, and I'm pleased that Senator Hoeven introduced companion language in the Senate last week to move it quickly to conference. Mr. Arriola, could you speak how our energy relationship with Mexico has shifted recently? What benefits does the U.S. stand to gain from an integrated North American energy market between Canada, Mexico, and the United States?
Sure, Congressman. I think it's, this truly has been a win-win situation between the United States and Mexico as it pertains to energy trade. In fact, in the most recent year that I've seen the numbers, there's actually been a trade surplus from U.S. products and services related to energy that go to Mexico. In fact, I think the last number that I saw was roughly an $11 billion surplus on the side of the U.S. We're continuing to provide them with natural gas. We're continuing to provide them with other fuel sources. For example, if you look at gasoline, diesel, and other jet fuel resources, the United States has roughly a 90-day inventory supply. Mexico has 2 to 3 days. So there are more opportunities to build infrastructure in Mexico that can receive future U.S. products, and that's one of the things that we're looking at.
Mr. Chairman, I know I'm out of time, but if...
We're going to have votes in the House floor shortly, so...
Okay. Well, I was just going to say that it's not just Mexico, it's also LNG exports. In fact, my joke is anybody in Louisiana and Texas who has a 5-foot ditch off the Gulf of Mexico, they want an LNG export facility. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. McKinley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this meeting. As Dr. Yergin noted earlier in his testimony, and as not only this time but previously, there is indeed an abundance of natural gas located in the Marcellus and Utica shale gases in West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And it's estimated that this region will produce about 37% of the nation's natural gas production by the year 2040. These shale gases underscore this potential of an historic renaissance that he referred to in American energy. But as we've heard earlier, the naysayers continue to trot out their tired, disproven talking points. Unfortunately, the facts have proved otherwise. That just in the last 10 years, the CO2 emissions in America have gone down by 20%. So the shale gas has given the Appalachian area a breath of fresh air, perhaps a chance finally to transform and revitalize a whole region of the country. And subsequently, Rick Perry and the DOE have concluded that there's a need perhaps to develop a second petrochemical center located in the Appalachian region. A recent study by HSS Market concluded that the economic advantages of extracting ethane in the Appalachian region is concluded that the resin could be produced at 23% lower there than being shipped down to the Gulf Coast to the crackers and back up. So I think that was an interesting conclusion with that. Now, we can achieve lower energy costs and dramatically decrease it if we take a different approach and work together. Congress should fully innovate research to reduce emissions. The concern, Dr. Kennedy, you're concerned about, if we just put the money into research. The technology American scientists could develop in higher efficiency and low emissions could be sold around the world, marketed around the world, and thereby address this worldwide concern about greenhouse gases. Because we've got to remember that the world is going to increase its energy production use by 28% by 2040, and fossil fuels by 2040 will account still for 75% of the energy use. So what my concern is, if that's the case, what are we doing with China and India? Isn't it time that some of our members recognize that until the rest of the world, especially India and China, produces electricity more cleanly, continuing to over-regulate fossil fuels in America will have virtually no effect on the global environment. Therefore, shouldn't we be innovate first, do the research, and then regulate? So, Dr. Yergin, with this shale gas present, this revolution going on in Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia, what potential do you see for a potential petrochemical industry up in the Appalachian area? And with projection, they're saying as much as $36 billion invested, maybe 100,000 jobs. Do you believe that?
Some people see the Marcellus now, the region, and the Utica as the largest gas field or gas concentration in the world. I thought that some companies had actually committed to build petrochemical facilities there. I thought Shell was doing it, but you have a...
Shell is doing it in Monaca, Pennsylvania. That's at one portion of it, but there are others. I know they're doing some, the ethane storage hub that we've been promoting here has been, the question is whether or not any of you have the realization that could this be a center of a secondary? We're not trying to replace Houston, but just is there a secondary, possibility?
Sure. I mean, the resource is so enormous there. I mean, as you said, it's going to be such a large part. Also, I did want to say, you mentioned the R&D. One of the big themes over at the World Gas Congress has been specifically about methane and applying the technologies to address methane. So, I mean, there is definitely a research agenda to address the questions you're talking about, including methane.
Dr. Aaron, any comments from you?
I really don't have anything to add on that other than given the infrastructure that we have and lacking pipelines in some parts of our country, it may make sense to develop those centers that you're talking about closer to the source themselves. So from an economies of scale standpoint, that could very well make sense.
Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch.
Thank you very much. I thank the panel. Mr. Yergin, your opening statement indicated with the shale gas, it just has been a huge game changer in jobs, in economic activity, in our ability to go from being an importer to an exporter, maybe the largest one. One of the other issues, though, that I'd like to focus on is energy efficiency. I mean, it's tremendous that we have these resources and it creates the economic activity and the jobs. But some of us are concerned also about carbon emissions and the impact that has. And my understanding is that the energy efficiency policies that we've been able, and I've worked a lot with Mr. McKinley on this, actually energy efficiency has allowed us to save on the demand for energy. The Alliance to Save Energy says that if we tried to run today's economy without energy efficiency improvements that have taken place since '73, we'd need 55% more energy supplies than we now use. Could you describe what you understand to be the Trump administration policies on energy efficiency, A, and B, whether even as we exploit the shale gale, does that suggest that we can take our eye off the importance of efficiency?
I'm not really in a position to address what the, because I haven't studied what the Trump administration's specific policies are. I do agree with you. When I began my work in energy, it was focused on energy efficiency. And off the top of my head, I would say that we're probably twice as energy efficient today as a country than we were, a few decades ago. So I think energy efficiency is a very important, I regard energy efficiency as another energy source.
Yeah. And in my view is the energy companies have to be part of this solution. They have to be. And I'm wondering, you're over at the meeting with the gas folks, 12,000 people. Are there any topics that are being discussed specifically as to energy efficiency?
Well, in the speeches I heard, it was certainly said that, this has to be a big part of the energy mix. And, if we hadn't become more efficient as a country, we would be we would also be in a very difficult place. The thing about energy efficiency so much, it goes through the entire economy. It's decisions that people make when they build houses. It's new processes in industry. What's always struck me about it's a very decentralized activity, but there has been a general trend towards being more efficient.
Is there a place for appropriate regulation in order to meet energy efficiency standards, Mr. Yergin?
Yeah, I mean, you can see it, for instance, in housing and other places, and that regulation has been part of the mix.
Thank you. Mr. Arriola, would you agree with that? I mean, as a representative of a major energy company?
What we see, Congressman, is a lot of that regulation happens state by state. So, for example, in California, whether it's the housing codes or through our Public Utilities Commission, there's a lot of work that goes on in energy efficiency.
So,
and our companies are directly involved to help facilitate that.
All right. Mr. Hamm, I know you've been supportive of the president's deregulatory agenda, but we've heard some testimony here about the appropriate use of regulations like Energy Star. Do you support that?
Well, the best efficiencies is gained by the private sector. For instance, in 2014, we had 1,950 rigs working. Today, we've got 1,000 rigs doing the same job. So basically, you've got one rig as efficient as 5 were in the 1980s. So that's efficiencies that you can gain from the private sector.
Well, that's efficiency in the exploitation process, not in the use process, right? Now, do you believe that EPA has a role, Environmental Protection Agency, in promulgating appropriate regulatory mechanisms for energy efficiency?
I don't think EPA is there to enforce the law and basically ensure that the rule of law is followed. And so they have that job to do, and they do it sometimes very well, most times very well. But as far as efficiencies, I think it all be.
I just have time for one more question. What's your view on the president's tariffs on oil exports to China, or the China retaliatory tariffs on us with respect to our oil exports?
Right now, we don't have tariffs that apply to oil going to China, and we'll see if that happens or not.
Are you okay with the tariffs? You think that's a good thing for business?
Am I okay with tariffs? I think tariffs are counterproductive. I think everybody here believes that. What's going on right now is setting some of that straight. You know, the countries have gotten too carried away with tariffs in the past. Nothing was done about it. And so some of those corrections are being made today.
I yield back. Thank you.
When his time has expired, Mr. Griffith.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it. Dr. Yergin, appreciate you being here today. I got a couple of questions in that regard with the geopolitical aspects of all of this. So we've heard a lot about foreign countries, and Mr. McKinley touched base on it, and we were talking with one of the foreign countries earlier today. But isn't it true that if we were suddenly to cut off American gas exports, that a lot of the countries, particularly some of the developing economies, would just continue to use coal from other parts of the world?
Well, I mean, we're just part, and we're still a beginning part of the LNG market. We'll have more when you guys get going. But I think there is absolutely, there's a competition going on a global basis for, what's going to be the balance between coal and natural gas and renewables for developing countries. And I think many of them, there's definitely a push towards using more gas. We see 15, 20 countries that don't import LNG now will import LNG because they want to clean up and not clean up their electric generation.
Well, and one of the questions that I would have as we look at this is, as we go to using the LNG, are we able to compete worldwide with that? Because obviously, and I represent a coal district like Mr. McKinley does as well, obviously, it doesn't make sense very often unless you need some good high-quality, as they called it this morning, coking coal, but the what we call metallurgical coal in my neck of the woods. Unless you need that, if you're just buying steam coal, it's hard to buy that for basic energy. In some parts of the world, it's hard for us to ship it to them and compete against the Australians and insert about 4 or 5 other countries. But from what I understand, you correct me if I'm wrong, our LNG resources can reach worldwide and be pretty competitive wherever we go. Isn't that true?
Yes, we're quite competitive in the market. We're maybe not as competitive as some pipeline suppliers in Europe, but there's definite, I saw it this morning at this APEC conference with all these Asian countries. They're really interested in importing LNG from the United States.
And I think that makes a lot of sense. And as a part of that, I would have to say that while I don't have any of the Marcellus, DOE earlier this year announced a project in conjunction with Virginia Tech in my district to investigate the resource potential for reservoirs in the Nora gas field of Southwest Virginia. And I'm excited that this research is being conducted to improve our understanding, but it appears that we're down another level from what they've looked at before, and so they're drilling some deep mines or some deep wells to see what we have down there. And we're excited about that because we have coal bed methane, but we haven't been doing much on any other gas. We don't have the Marcellus or the Utica shale, but we may have this, and we're excited about that. We already have some petrochemicals. Eastman Chemical, even though it's in Kingsport, Tennessee, and people say, why are you interested in it? They have 10,000 employees, and 1,000 of them drive the 8 miles from my district to the plant. So we're excited about that. But I think it's important that we realize that as we move forward, this is important for the world. I also would echo some of the comments my colleagues have made that we need to do the research because it's not just the United States that we're dealing with, it's the world. And when we're looking at global warming, et cetera, if we don't provide the research to burn our fuels more efficiently worldwide, and something that the rest of the world can also afford and obtain, then they're going to continue to burn coal. They're going to continue to burn all kinds of products and put stuff in the air. And I know it bores people, but it's just my favorite factoid of all time. And NASA did a study. They followed a sandstorm from Central Asia in the middle of the Gobi Desert, and it takes 10 days for the air to get from the middle of the Gobi Desert to the eastern shore of Virginia, based on their satellite research. So we need to work on this from a worldwide viewpoint, not put American jobs out of business because we're trying to set the standard, because the rest of the world is looking for jobs, period. And if they have to use something improper or less efficient, they'll do it. But if we can find a way to do it through research, they'll share in that. Everybody wants to have a cleaner world, but they want to have jobs first, because the number one thing is to have jobs, and that helps your health as well. Wouldn't that be correct, Dr. Yergin?
Yes, and I love your factoid. I'd never heard that before.
That's a fun factoid.
Yeah.
All right, I yield back.
Mr. Wahlberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here. Mr. Yergin, in your testimony, you mentioned that by 2025, as many as 4 million jobs, direct, indirect, and induced, could be supported by unconventional oil and gas activities. Could you explain in further detail for us the types of jobs that are supported by unconventional oil and gas activities?
Well, those three categories are really categories that the Department of Commerce uses. The direct jobs would be working on one of Harold Hamm's rigs, working in the oil field. Indirect would be a kind of service job supporting that. And then the induced jobs is the money that flows into the community because, as been seen in Pennsylvania, suddenly people are able to buy cars, are able to buy houses, realtors, service computer specialists in California, financial people in New York, and so that's kind of the methodology that's used for estimating that. And what it really says that these supply chains go all the way across the country, and the money that's being spent is staying in this country and being distributed in our economy.
Okay, moving along with that, several of you mentioned the numbers of jobs, direct, indirect, in construction, as well as exploration, refining, all that go on there. Let me ask Mr. Hamm, Mr. Arriola, what types of job training and recruitment efforts are you using to meet those needs? I mean, we see all across the vocational spectrum today a real lack of people to do the jobs, real-world jobs that we need. And what are you doing to train people for the jobs?
Congressman, I can tell you in the case of the LNG facilities that we're talking about, we work very closely, obviously, with our subcontractors that are hiring people, but we're also working directly with the trades to train people, whether it's welders, whether it's supply procurement experts. There's a whole host of jobs, whether they're low-skilled or high-skilled, that we're trying to do. And I think one of the great things is we're creating a pipeline of skilled workers that, especially in some of these areas, that workers that wouldn't necessarily have opportunities, that can now go from facility to continue to build. So sometimes we think of these as temporary jobs, but they're really skills that are being developed that can be utilized across the construction industry to continue to build energy infrastructure.
So you're working with the trades. What other, I mean...
We're working with the trades in the case of our utilities, where we're enhancing pipelines to carry natural gas. We're working with the junior colleges and other organizations to identify people that are coming directly out of high school or junior colleges to give them the skills that they need to be able to be productive members of our team.
Okay, Mr. Hamm, I'd ask you if you'd respond as well, especially since being a innovation in directional drilling and all of that.
Yeah, thank you. What we've seen really that added so many new jobs is these very expensive petrochemical plants that have been added with all the natural gas resources that we have. In fact, it's been estimated that 1 out of 8 people, have been associated with our industry. So it's very intense, particularly in Houston and some of the areas that these plants locate. And so it's very intense. Vocational technical training has helped a great deal in places like Oklahoma as far as our industry goes, and has been a great resource. But it seems like we're down to about 3.8% of unemployment in this country now, which is wonderful. And the closer you get to that 3% level, the harder it is to find those employees that you need. But so far we've been able to do it.
Recruit and train your own? Is that how you?
We recruit and we train. We train both at the company level, and then also we use technical schools for training as well.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, everyone, for being here. It's been a great hearing so far. As we all know, the United States is well on our way to becoming a net energy exporter by 2020. I think a net natural gas exporter was first time last year, first time since 1957, I believe. I commend the Trump administration's support for robust domestic energy production, which has consequently strengthened our leadership on the world stage. Mr. Arriola, you noted in your testimony that the failure of the U.S. to seize the current LNG opportunity has international implications. I couldn't agree with you more. And besides the fact exporting gas to U.S. allies will contribute up to 452,000 American jobs between 2016 and 2035, add about $73.6 billion annually to the U.S. economy. We can also provide energy security to our allies. Prior to serving on the Energy and Commerce Committee, I served as chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and I utilized that role as that chairman to focus on energy opportunities in North and South America and how we can work to achieve not only American energy independence and energy security, but also hemispheric energy security and independence. In this region of the world, we have the ability through U.S. LNG exports to help the energy poor countries reduce their dependence on corrupt state-owned regimes and increase the quality of life for so many people around the world. I talk about quality of life a lot of times, how energy can improve the quality of lives just in infant mortality rate through energy and a constant 24/7 baseload power supply that energy, possibly with LNG, natural gas-fired power plants providing that electricity, can keep babies alive, where you have intermittent power now and neonatal intensive care and incubators cannot run to keep those babies alive. You see high infant mortality rate. A lot of quality of life issues that we as Americans, with our abundant energy resources, exporting those to our friends and allies around the world to improve the quality of life of folks elsewhere. So, Mr. Arriola, from your perspective, how can LNG terminals further open up access for U.S. LNG in these markets?
Well, Congressman, your point about natural gas and different types of energy impacting more than just the economic side is truly right on. And in fact, I spoke to a professor from the Stanford Natural Gas Initiative yesterday, and he shared with me in a conference we were at that although we don't talk about it very much, indoor air pollution is one of the largest killers in this world. And we don't think about it here in the United States because we have, for the most part, natural gas or electricity to help from a cooking fuels perspective. But if you go to other countries, developing countries, they use wood, they use dung, they use charcoal. And last year, roughly 4 million people died from indoor air pollution caused by cooking fuels.
And I'm glad you said, I talk about that all the time. The indoor air quality is terrible when you're burning on wood, charcoal, dung, other things that people around the world have to cook on. Right. And the fact that they don't have a 24/7 baseload power supply to keep their food fresh in a refrigerated environment.
So not only are we impacting economic prosperity around the globe by being able to export clean U.S. natural gas, but we're changing people's lives. We're changing the health and their livelihood.
Improving the lives of so many people around the world through American resources that we take for granted. We take for granted that light's going to come on when we flip the switch. We take for granted that the machines of industry to produce the widgets that America produces, that electricity is going to be there to provide for those machineries to turn on. But you know what? It's not just a third world problem. Even in second world and first world Europe, they have problems with intermittency and power supplies. So this is geopolitics of American energy. When I was in Spain, and I understand Portugal is the same way, but they want to be the LNG importer for Western Europe. Because right now, Western Europe's relying on who? Russia. Russia's a gas station masquerading as a country. But they're providing that natural gas to Europe, and they use the levers of influence of turning that spigot on and off to affect policy, not only in Eastern Europe, but in Western Europe. And as those pipelines continue to be built to provide that natural gas, Western Europe's looking west to the United States, a stable energy producer, an ally and a friend, to provide LNG so they can meet their energy needs and lessen their dependence not on the Middle East for their energy, but lessen their dependence on Russia and their less dependence on Russian gas and more strong dependence on possibly, hopefully, American LNG exports to provide that energy. So the geopolitics are real. I appreciate your comments, and let's improve the lives of folks around the world through American energy production. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
John yields back. I regret to say that votes on the floor have started again. They're not going to be completed, they tell us, until after 4 o'clock. I know a couple of our witnesses have to leave by 3:45. So I'm going to ask that Mr. Olson, who's next in line for questions, take the chair, and he will ask questions, at which point we will adjourn. And those members wishing to still ask questions will do it in writing. And if you could respond in a timely basis, we'll adjourn rather than keep you here till 4:15, knowing that all of you are pretty much gone. Mr. Olson.
I thank the chair and welcome to our 4 witnesses. I want to start by saying congratulations to our good friends at Sempra. Big merger with Encore. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Mr. Arriola, your company is working on some significant LNG export terminals along the Gulf Coast. You mentioned Cameron being up and running, Port Arthur coming online. Can you talk about why getting American liquefied natural gas to market is time sensitive? Why does it matter how fast we ramp this production up? What markets are in jeopardy if we delay or drag this out?
Sure, Congressman. I think as we've discussed, when foreign countries decide to enter into contracts for LNG, they're ordinarily in the 20 to 30 year time frame. And so as I'm buying a product or a service for 20 or 30 years, I don't need to come back every year and re-up. And so as U.S. companies, including Sempra, look at building a project, whether it's in Cameron or in Port Arthur, we're really focused on trying to get all those contracts together up front so that we can get them financed and to build the project. If we can't get those projects this year or next year because somebody else has already signed up these 20 to 30 year contracts, we're out of the market. And the construction jobs that we've been talking about and the impact to the local economy goes away, or never develops, I should say.
Yeah, thousands and thousands of American jobs. Mr. Hamm, the people back home in Texas 22 want me to thank you for your efforts in the Bakken shale play to change the entire world in America's energy future. We are now an energy-dominant country because of you, Mr. Hamm, and a Texan named George Mitchell at the Barnett Shale play. My question is, can you talk about the most important actions that the Trump administration can take to help you with oil and gas production? You mentioned adjusting the CAFE standards, the ACC. How about public lands, capturing other things? What can we do to help you out, make sure this production continues and doesn't get stifled by the Washington, D.C.?
Well, we have a friendly audience here that listens to us today, which is good. We need to do a lot with federal lands. They should also participate in this energy renaissance, and they haven't up to this point. The bulk of what has been done has been on fee lands, particularly in the Bakken and Texas. Yep. And we need to get it where permitting could be done rapidly instead of waiting, 6 months to a year. And so that's one thing we're working on that. And we have an audience that's listening and wanting to do the right thing. So I think we're moving in the right direction. We just need to keep them all rolling to get it corrected in what we're doing.
Yes, again, thank you for example of what the private sector can do. The private sector developed directional drilling, hydraulic fracturing. That wasn't something that came from D.C. That came from Harold Hamm and George Mitchell, so thank you for that. My final question is for you, Dr. Yergin. Let's talk about Sarah Week. It used to be Sarah Day, maybe Sarah Hour. In 83, you got that ball rolling, and now rolled into the energy capital of the entire world, Houston, Texas. Your testimony mentioned how the revolution in shale oil and gas, the shale gale, has had an enormous impact on relationships abroad. I've seen that firsthand. You mentioned India. I went there this past March. Their motto is natural gas for today, renewables for the future. But as you mentioned, right now, they've signed a contract for 20 years of liquefied natural gas, I think somewhere about 14.4 million metric tons from America to India. That helps them get their air cleaner. It helps them where they want to go. Also, as you mentioned, they've got, I heard, 2 million barrels of American crude oil that they haven't had for almost 50 years. They're taking the wood to OPEC and Russia with our energy. And so my questions are, can you tell me more details about what that means for allies? We can help out India, we can help out South Korea, Japan, even help out China getting their air cleaner. How can we use this energy renaissance to make the world better?
Well, I think, first of all, by helping to reduce conflict. Secondly, I think it builds confidence. I think it really, what's happened here in the United States is actually a big contribution to energy security for the whole world, and we benefit from that. So I think it radiates out from it. And I think what you described in India, I've seen it in other countries too. It gives a, they have a deeper relationship with the United States, and it connects them more to us. And I think that's very beneficial for our overall political situation in the world.
One example, Mr. Shimkus and I had this poster on the floor last week. This big tanker ship called Independence was pulling into Lithuania. Probably 500 people, normal people from Lithuania, were greeting this tanker ship going, yay, yay. That's because they know that takes Mr. Putin's weapon away from him forever.
Well, I think it's true that what's happened with LNG to Europe, and it's not only us, but from others, it's really, in a sense, depoliticized. It turns Europe more into a gas market and takes out the kind of political implications for it. So I think it's something that's very welcome in those countries, that they know that we're there and we're their friend.
I'm out of time. Just one warning, sir. My Houston Astros will beat the Boston Red Sox again this year, going to the World Series.
What a forecaster.
Pursuant to committee rules, I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record. I ask that witnesses submit their answers to responses within 10 business days upon receipt of those questions. Without objection, this subcommittee is adjourned.